Our lesson for today is going to be on photosynthesis and its limiting factors. We're going to talk about what those limiting factors are. We're going to have a look at some data. We're going to have a look at some graphs to see if we can work out what's going on with the things limiting the rate of photosynthesis in plants. There are three things that can affect and limit the rate of photosynthesis. And when we say rate of photosynthesis, we're talking about how fast the photosynthesis is happening inside a plant. So three things that can make it slow down or make it speed up. The three things are light intensity, so how strong the light is, how much light energy there is available, the amount of CO2, the amount of carbon dioxide concentration in the air. The higher the concentration, generally the more photosynthesis you can do, and the temperature as well. The temperature is also important. So these three things are the limiting factors for photosynthesis. The obvious one that you would probably think would be water, but we don't tend to consider water to be a limiting factor in photosynthesis. The reason is that the amount of water that a plant needs for photosynthesis is actually quite small. It doesn't need that much, especially in comparison to the amount of water that a plant will take up. So a plant will take up quite a lot of water and it will rise up from the roots up towards the top via transpiration, but only a small amount of that is actually used for photosynthesis. So they take in a lot more water than they actually need, and there's often water available in their cells and so on for photosynthesis should they need it. So we don't consider water to be a limiting factor for photosynthesis. So three questions then. What would happen to the rate of photosynthesis? Would it go faster or would it go slower in the following circumstances? And you can pause the video here and you can have a bit of a go at seeing if you can answer them. If you can give a reason as well, that'd be perfect. So if the sun were to go behind a cloud, the rate of photosynthesis would probably reduce. It would probably go slower. The reason is that photosynthesis requires light energy, and it gets that light energy from the sun. If the sun goes behind a cloud, there's going to be less light energy available, and so the rate of photosynthesis will drop. If factories pump out more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the rate of photosynthesis will probably increase. It will probably actually move faster. The reason being that plants require CO2, they require carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. If there's more of it available, it should hopefully make the rate of photosynthesis increase. The last question, what would happen if a plant is moved from a winter garden, so a cold garden, into a greenhouse? Now, greenhouses are generally speaking much warmer than a garden in winter, and temperature is a limiting factor of photosynthesis. So moving it somewhere warmer would probably increase the rate of photosynthesis. Now, here's a graph. Let's have a look at this graph. Let's have a look at the axes on this graph. The y-axis shows us the rate of photosynthesis. So down at the bottom here would be a very slow rate of photosynthesis. Up at the top would be a fast rate. So not very much photosynthesis happening, a lot of photosynthesis happening. On the x-axis we have light intensity, so how bright the light is. We've got this shape here. What does this shape of graph show us? What it shows us is that as the light intensity increases, as the amount of light energy available increases, the rate of photosynthesis also increases. But this increase is slowing down, so we have this curve. Because the rate of increase slows down as light intensity increases, we get this curved shape until we get to point B here, at which point the rate of photosynthesis remains constant. So we don't get an increase in the rate of photosynthesis past a certain point. Now, the natural question to ask at this point is why? Why wouldn't you just get the rate of photosynthesis going up and up and up in a nice straight line as you increase the amount of light available? And it comes down to the other things available in the environment. The amount of CO2 in the environment is limited and the temperature is not ideal, then you're going to hit a wall at some point past which you won't have the rate of photosynthesis increasing. So you can make the light as bright as you want, but if you've got these other things acting as limiting factors, then you're not going to get the rate of photosynthesis increasing. So here's an analogy for you. Let's say you're making a cake. Making a really simple cake. Your cake is only going to contain flour, eggs, and sugar. I know that won't make a particularly nice cake, but flour, eggs, and sugar only. That's all you're going to put in. Now let's say you've got one chicken laying eggs for the whole factory making these cakes. you're not going to be able to make very many cakes a day because you have this limiting factor. You have this chicken that only lays 1 egg a day. You're only going to be able to maybe put out 1 cake per day. You've only got 1 egg. Now let's say you buy another chicken, and this chicken can also lay an egg. So now you have 2 eggs a day. You've started to increase the number of eggs per day. You're going to start to increase the number of cakes that you can produce per day. Let's say you decide this is quite a good idea and you invest some money and you buy 1 million chickens. Now you have 1 million eggs that you can use for making cakes. Would you be able now to make 1 million cakes per day? Well, probably not, because your flour and your sugar supplies would probably not be able to take account of that huge number of eggs that you've now got. So you're going to end up with the flour and the sugar becoming limiting factors. You can have as many eggs as you want, but at some point your rate of producing cakes is going to level off because you still need those other things. You still need the flour and the sugar. And the same thing goes here. You can increase the light intensity, and that will increase the rate of photosynthesis at first. But after a while, when the light gets bright enough, we then also need to have the carbon dioxide available and the temperature to be optimum for the rate of photosynthesis to increase further. And if those things aren't there, then it's going to level off like this. Here's a very similar looking graph. We still have the rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis here. But on the x-axis, we now have the concentration of carbon dioxide. What does this graph show us? Well, what this graph shows us again is that as the concentration of CO2 increases, the rate of photosynthesis also increases. So we still have something going up, leading to an increased rate of photosynthesis. But again, we've got this curve. So we need to say that that increase will slow down. That increase will essentially decrease until we get to point B, at which the rate of photosynthesis again remains constant. And it's again because we've got these other limiting factors in there. You can pump as much carbon dioxide into the plant as you want, but if it's not getting enough sunlight to provide the energy needed for photosynthesis, or the temperature isn't optimal, then the rate of photosynthesis is going to level off. It's the average percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere. 0.04%, about 400 parts per million at the moment is what we have in our atmosphere. Is that the same around a tree or around a plant at all times of the day? Have a think about photosynthesis and respiration. Would that value be the same in the immediate vicinity of a plant at all times of the day? The answer is no. At night time, the plant won't be doing any photosynthesis. Now plants, trees, whatever they might be, still need to do respiration. They still need to generate the energy they need to perform the things going on inside their cells. So they still actually need to take in oxygen. So a tree will take in oxygen at night and will actually release CO2, because with respiration we take in oxygen and we give out the gas CO2 as a waste product. So trees will also respire, and they will do that at night time because there's no photosynthesis to happen. Then in the morning, when the sun comes up, that CO2 that they've generated around themselves over the course of the night will then be used for photosynthesis to generate their food. So at night time, the levels of CO2 around a plant are increased. In the daytime, the levels of CO2 around a plant are decreased. What about this graph? What does this graph show us? Again, we've got the rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis, as we have with the previous two graphs. And on the x-axis, we've got temperature this time round, starting at 0 and going all the way up to 50. Now, this graph looks a bit different from the first two. The first two graphs looked pretty similar. This one looks a bit different. We can still start off with the same kind of explanation. We can start saying that as the temperature increases, the rate of photosynthesis also increases. But it is different. We need to start talking about this peak that we've got here. That increase is slowing down until it reaches the peak at about 40 degrees, 38 to 40 degrees Celsius. After that, it starts to fall off pretty rapidly. So we have an increase in the rate of photosynthesis as the temperature goes up. So 0 degrees would be like it's snowing outside. 40 degrees is pretty warm. And above that, it falls off very, very quickly. Why might it fall off so fast after about 38 to 40 degrees Celsius? Well, photosynthesis is controlled by enzymes in the same way that the processes inside your body are controlled by enzymes. And those enzymes have an optimal temperature that they like to work at. When the temperature rises above that optimal temperature, they start to denature, and then they no longer function in the way that they're supposed to. An enzyme looks a bit like a slinky, one that's been given to a toddler and has been all jumbled up and coiled up, a slinky that's essentially broken, a spring that's been all wound around itself. And this spring, this coil, will have these areas in it known as active sites, these little dips. These dips fit very perfectly with what's known as the substrate. Substrate would be some molecule that is trying to break down into smaller parts. Now, if you heat up an enzyme too much, that coil starts to loosen up and it starts to change shape. And the active site of the coil, of that protein, the enzyme, starts to change shape as well. And as it changes shape, it no longer then fits in with the substrate, with the thing that it's trying to break down. And so it no longer is able to catalyze reactions. Now, photosynthesis is a reaction that can be catalyzed, a reaction that can have a catalyst, and that biological catalyst that provides that is the enzyme. Above a certain temperature, that enzyme no longer works. Okay, so let's have a look at this. This is a GCSE question, so a question that was in a previous exam paper, and something similar to what you might see again. Scientists investigated the effects of carbon dioxide concentration, temperature, and light on photosynthesis rate in tomato plants growing in a greenhouse. And we've got this graph here on the right-hand side. Now, what this graph shows us is the results of their experiments. Let's have a look at this. So the top line here shows what they saw, the readings they got when they had a temperature of 25 degrees Celsius, concentration of carbon dioxide of 0.1% in the atmosphere, and on the x-axis we've got the intensity of the light. So when the lights were off, dim lights, medium strength lights, and quite strong lights as we go across here. And these are, this line shows the rate of photosynthesis with these conditions. The next line down, similar kind of thing, but instead of 25 degrees Celsius and 0.1, this next line down was an experiment where it was 20 degrees Celsius, 0.1% CO2, so still raised levels of CO2. And again, the light levels were increased over the course of time to see how that changed it. Next line down, it was hot again, 25 degrees Celsius, but the levels of CO2 were back down to more like what they are in the atmosphere. We have 0.04 in our atmosphere, but 0.03 here. And this last line, this line down at the bottom here, shows what results they got when they had 20 degrees Celsius as the temperature, low levels of CO2, and of course they were increasing the levels of light as they went across. Now, we've got a farmer, and the farmer wants to grow some tomatoes in a greenhouse. He's read about our investigation from these scientists, and he knows that during the growing season, so when tomatoes are normally grown, the natural daylight, so the sunlight that streams in from outside, normally has an intensity higher than about 30,000 lux. The light intensity here is measured in lux. It's not a unit that we need to worry about for GCSE, but that's just the unit that we have for light intensity. The farmer decides to use these conditions for his greenhouse. And what you need to do is suggest why he might have decided to use these conditions. So he went for 20 degrees Celsius, 0.1% carbon dioxide concentration, and he decided to not spend any extra money on lighting. So why did he decide to use these conditions for growing the tomatoes? This is a 4 marker. You should be trying to use the information that you've got there in the graph. Pause the video, have a bit of a go, and then we'll go through the answer. Okay, so let's have a look at the answer to this question then. Let's see. So the mark scheme, which I'm going to show you here, says that you get a mark for saying any one of these 4 things. The first thing that you could potentially get a mark for is saying that he's not going to spend any money on extra lighting or heating at all, because he wants to make more profit. He wants to make more money, which is a perfectly understandable thing to think about. So there's an economic argument going on here. It's not simply about the biology. There's also economics coming into it. Having a look at the graph, we can see that if you have low levels of carbon dioxide, so there's 0.03 here, if you just spend your money on making it warmer in the greenhouse, so putting in some expensive heaters perhaps, you're not really going to get much bang for your buck. You get 5 on the rate of photosynthesis here, But if you spend money increasing the temperature up to 25 degrees Celsius, it only jumps up to 7 at its maximum point. So you don't really get much of an increase for spending that money. So raising the temperature to 25 degrees Celsius, if you've still got regular levels of carbon dioxide, doesn't really make very much difference. But if we keep the temperature at 20 degrees, but instead of changing it up to 25, instead what we do is we increase the amount of CO2, we actually see quite a large jump. It jumps up from 5 all the way up to 17, so over 3 times as high. So we get over 3 times the increase of photosynthesis rate if all we do is increase the amount of CO2. So a limiting factor there is obviously carbon dioxide. By increasing the amount of carbon dioxide, we end up with that limiting factor making less of a difference, and we get a much faster rate of photosynthesis. Now, we could also push it all the way up to 25 degrees Celsius. We could have 0.1% on the carbon dioxide concentrations. We could spend some money on increasing the carbon dioxide concentration. We could also spend some money on increasing the temperature. And that would push it up from 5, which is our sort of baseline, up to 26.5 is what that looks like there. So over 5 times, but it's going to cost a lot of money. If we're spending all this money, maybe it's not worth it to also do the heating. It certainly seems worth it to increase the levels of CO2, but is it really worth it to also do the heating? The farmer's obviously decided not. Now, he's not going to spend any money on extra lighting either, because natural daylight, we were told, is 30,000 or above, and if he increases the amount of light going in, it's not going to increase the rate of photosynthesis at all. So not a limiting factor here. No point in increasing it. Okay, so that's that. So that's the limiting factors. We have carbon dioxide concentration, we have temperature, and we have light intensity. And you should be able to apply those to GCSE questions like this one. Thank you very much.